I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello everybody.
And welcome to GM Tools Tragedy in Games.
That's right.
We've done a fair number of other episodes on a variety of thematic elements in games. We've talked about horror in games. We've talked about comedy in games. We've talked about mysteries. We've talked about all sorts of things. But we haven't really talked about tragedy in games and how to handle that.
That's true. And while it may be obvious that horror in games is going to require some amount of pre-discussion and consent from players, content warning, it's not necessarily as obvious that tragedy also requires consent and a content warning, but it does. When used correctly, the concept of tragedy can lead to a catharsis and just this feeling of purging out the negative emotions and then feeling better after a successful use of tragedy. But not everybody is ready for or wants to do that at any given time. Sometimes people are stressed out and just want to do a power fantasy where everything is relatively happy, at least once the PCs are here. Mm-hmm. And so using tragedy in a game needs to be something that you get some buy-in from the group. That's the first way to make sure that your use of tragedy doesn't backfire on you.
Yeah. So, when you talk about until the PCs arrive, certainly there's a lot of room for tragedy as a story device, a reason that provides characterization for NPCs, or that helps to set up a situation where heroes are needed.
Yes, but there's actually a difference between a tragic backstory and using tragedy directly in a game. You could certainly have the stereotypical, my character's an orphan because of the fact that their parents were killed by the Dark Lord, and now I'm fighting the Dark Lord. And you could have that in a game that is absolutely does not have any aspects of tragedy in the game. But you definitely could have tragic backstory that amplifies or promotes the use of in-game tragedy. And you can also have in-game tragedy even if it only arrives, even if it only happens before the PCs get there, if it's particularly tragic enough.
Yeah. So I think there's a few factors here. There's sort of the scope of the tragedy. There's the degree of the PC's personal investment, and there's how much the PCs can do to improve the situation. Because you certainly have situations, even in published adventure paths, where the assumption is you're not going to be able to fully fix a situation. Bad things are still going to happen. I think about in Iron Fang Invasion right in the beginning. You're in a place that's under siege, and the assumption is that you're not going to be able to save everyone. You're not going to be able to fix everything. You'll be able to fix a few things, but ultimately this isn't a battle that you can win, right? There's still going to be things that go wrong that you're not going to be able to fix.
That's right. And when you talk about the scope and when you talk about how tight it is into the PCs, those are sort of two very, very important parts of one measure of the tragedy, which is sort of like the acuteness of like how or the strength of the tragedy. So, for example, you could have a situation in an adventure path where, like, the PC's beloved patron throughout the entire AP is killed at the end of Book 5. On the one hand, and on the other hand, you could have a Starfinder AP where you're cruising around through space, and you hear that, like, a planet just in the solar system you just got blown up and trillions of people were killed.
Yeah.
And you probably don't care, other than, like, moral outrage about the planet that trillions of people were killed in the new solar system
it's sort of like the
but
whole,
you really care about that one person who was your patron.
Yeah. Or like, what do you care more about? The Death Star blowing up a planet, or somebody's dog died?
Yep. Exactly. So, in some cases, the scope of a tragedy can be so horrific and distant that it actually winds up making it not an acutely felt tragedy. You just sort of numb over, or it becomes a plot point.
But that's also that also ties well into the general thought of what players are comfortable with, right? They may be comfortable dealing with the abstract. Oh yeah, the villain is going around and destroying towns, and we've got to stop the villain. But they wouldn't be comfortable going in as much on those personal stories of the NPCs who are affected.
Now we have to go to the town and hear from the people. It's like, well, I just started my family, but my wife and son were killed by the BBG who was destroying the town and flooded the town, and their waterlogged corpses were what I came home to from the mines.
Yeah.
And after that, a strange lung disease that the BBG had released in the mines killed all of my coworkers, or something like that. And then just like a horrific story that this miner tells that also equates to a ton of people dying that the PCs weren't around. But it can become more real when it gains personal and singular elements too.
And I mean, responding to tragedy is not easy to do in real life, and so it's certainly not going to be easy in a fictional game where it's like where you are trying to portray the role of this character and think about like how they would respond to a particular situation. So,
that's
Marcus,
right. And Alftro has pointed out the quote from Joseph Stalin that one death is a tragedy, but a huge number of deaths is a statistic, which is a very chilling statement that in some ways is true to the way people react to things.
Mm-hmm. I got a little distracted by your Stalin Googling one.
Yes, well, I thought it was from Stalin, but I didn't want to just say
you wanted to make
that
sure
it was a Stalin quote. If it
large numbers are
some of those quotes are attributed to someone who didn't say them just because that person was more famous.
You mean how like Einstein and Lincoln supposedly said literally everything that's ever been said?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yes, very true. Quote Abe Lincoln.
It was large numbers are hard to comprehend. Abe Lincoln.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. That's in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So, where were we?
We were talking about the sort of the scope and the immediacy of a tragedy and what it can mean.
There's also the sense of responsibility. So if a tragedy comes about because of the PC's specific actions, or because of their inaction, or because of their failure to achieve a particular goal, then it's going to be a lot more poignant to the PCs and a lot more impactful, as opposed to if it's something that was not something they could have affected or prevented. Especially
if it happens right in front of them. Mm-hmm. Like the bad guy presses the button that blows up the planet or whatever happens, and then they watch it on a viewing screen.
Yeah. But as we keep referring to the Death Star here.
Yep. Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it is a good example. Right?
Alderaan has been explode.
But
it's a great example because like people don't necessarily think of A New Hope and as being like a tragedy per se. But it's an establishing background detail. But if you look in on it, and if you made like, or similarly, it just depends on how you present it. Like actually, a really good example of that is Rogue One, because in versus Star Wars. In Star Wars, they're just like many very brave rebels died to get us this information, and that's not a tragedy. They just have the information. It's like there's more weight to it. But when you do an entire movie about the people who died to get them that information, now you've made it into some like more of a tragic sacrifice. So it's not just how many people died, but more like the way that you express it and the way that you put the emphasis on it and give it screen time. In the same way that when we were talking about either comedy or horror, that the same exact sequence of events can wind up becoming comedy or not, or horror or not, based on the delivery and the ambience and the way that you put emphasis on it.
Yeah. And another thing to watch for is sort of in the aftermath of tragic events in the game, how the different players have their characters respond. Because like if a player decides that their character is they don't want to really get into that, they're just kind of gonna have them shrug it off. Like that's fine. Like not everyone has to get into it. Whereas if a player decides that their character is now going to vow vengeance against the person who did this, or maybe even have some more complicated experiences.
Right. Like, my character in Kingmaker was scarred by tragedy, but not just because of a stereotypical tragic backstory that was just like, oh, that's the backstory, but, like, that shaped my character's anxiety and the way that he interacted with anything that happened. And so it caused him to become the person who since he was the king of the kingdom especially, was invested in everything. So any kind of thing that went wrong, if somebody died in his kingdom, was suddenly personal, and it was never just, oh, something happened over here. And so that was sort of it shaped the plot in some ways for in little ways for the entire campaign.
Yeah, in terms of like the strong focus on saving and protecting and resurrecting eventually people and preventing bad things from happening, the entire way that the kingdom structured its defenses to have like a very small army whose primary tactics were run away and hide and call for the PCs to help you.
Yes. Hey, our general really taught them how to run away.
No, he
and
didn't.
retreat into the city and backing off while taking very few losses and doing small harrying tactics while giving the civilians time to get away.
Yeah.
And that was all somewhat based on, like, this one bard who experienced tragedy in his life and was hesitant to even be part of this campaign, but one of his main things is just, like, he's never going to let that happen again.
Yeah. And I think, too, it's worth pointing out that when you're thinking about what types of tragedy to include in the game, obviously be careful with tragedies that are similar to things that your players have experienced or in particular are currently experiencing.
Like anything with a content warning, just like horror, but also with tragedy. It's very important. And the type of tragedy that you use also, not both the content of the tragedy and the type of tragedy can vary from group to group.
Yeah. And I know this is something that that Mark and I have discussed, because we had something in a campaign where my character's family came to harm, and I've found that to be distressing. So then I talked to him after that, and I'm like, okay, yeah, so we'll find out a way to sort of explain, we eventually found out a way to sort of explain in the story that had become better. And then that was like, okay, that's a line for me that we're not gonna deal with without discussing it carefully first.
Yep. And I'm grateful that there's not scrying and teleporting are uncommon tactics now.
Because it makes it a lot easier to explain in the story
why you weren't being scryed on while visiting your family and then enemies teleporting over.
Yeah. So certainly, it's nice if you can find a way to explain in the story of the game, but ultimately the comfort of the player comes first, even if you can't come up with a way to explain it.
That's right. You just kind of hand wave it off.
Yep. And there's also the sense of how much you zoom in too, right? How much do you focus on details versus how much do you pull back or fade to black?
Yep.
And those are great tools to use if you're running into something that does seem to be getting a little intense for folks.
So an important thing to note about tragedy is that tragedy is not just like something happens and it's sad.
Yeah.
There are various types of tragedy. Classic tragedy usually involves someone or something who is genuinely and generally heroic or admirable in many ways, but possesses some sort of tragic flaw that sort of undermines everything good about them and causes them to come to ruin or misfortune in a really bad way, sort of turning their strengths against them.
So these sort of classic tragic characters make for excellent villains, and they also make for excellent characters who may not be directly opposed to the PCs to start with, but who they have a more complicated relationship with. Right.
And it also can make sense for a PC, since some of the tragic flaws were even just like well, not faithful enough to the gods.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's more than one character I've played with who's, shall we say, not faithful enough to the gods.
Yes.
Has a little bit of the hubris or arrogance towards them that can be something that leads them down a particular line. The important part about this classical recipe for tragedy isn't even necessarily that they lose everything and are ruined, but instead that at some point they experience a
significant setback.
They both experience a setback or reversal of fortunes, as well as a moment of acknowledgement and realization of what their flaw was that led them to there. And they all have super Greek words in the classic tragedy, such as the moment of realization is the anagnorisis, and the reversal fortune is... Oh, I want to say peripeteia, but that might be something else.
I don't remember, but we don't need the.
It doesn't matter. The point is the thing that we said, which is that so you can have that structure with PCs, even if you have a group that mostly wants to succeed at things, by asking people, just in session 0, much like with everything else. So, what is your character's kind of flaw? What is their tragic flaw? What is the one thing that sometimes causes them not to be able to be as great as they think they should be or that they could be? And then you can have a plot line that sort of exposes that flaw and gives them a time for a moment of realization after a reversal.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even necessarily have to mean that what happens is the stereotypical tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy of, and then everyone dies at the end. It could just be like something goes somewhat badly, the PC realizes it, they grow out of it, and then eventually leads to a heroic success.
Yeah. And that's something that's a lot easier to incorporate into games as well. If you have these characters, also if you notice a character who is continually and always using the same strategy and falling back on the same things in a way that seems like it could be that it could be a flaw, even if the player didn't necessarily tell you, hey, I planned for this to be this character's flaw. Like, you have a character who is always charging on ahead, heedless of the advice of any NPC, and just convinced that they're going to be the best at doing things, or who doesn't really believe in taking precautions and just convinced that everything is going to turn out all right in the end, or who is always so impeccably cautious about anything that they'll just wait and wait and wait until they're absolutely certain that the time is right, even if they could be losing things in the meantime.
That's right. And in that sense, the sense we were talking about here with the a tragic flaw that's revealed partway through, you could even imagine for everyone who probably most viewers have watched the most recent 3 Star Wars movies, right? The second movie actually had elements of tragedy that most of Star Wars don't, because it's just they're like the classic hero's journey and heroic growth, when people all did a plan and they're like, this is a great plan, and they were just too cocky and everything failed.
Yeah.
And they just failed completely. And they realized that, oh, well, just being cocky and saying, let's do a plan, which almost always works in Star Wars.
Yeah.
In that movie, it was considered a tragic flaw. And they needed to be level-headed and considerate of the situation and the circumstances. And so that structure is one that you can use and still not necessarily ruin the PCs. Because in there, they escaped, but they had a serious setback and a reversal.
One that's extremely common for PCs is greed.
Yeah.
So a story where the PCs do something because they want to get more money, even if it's clearly not a great idea, or like they have a sense that this could be risky or whatever. They're just like, oh yeah, we'll totally go slay the dragon.
Or offer a powerful item that they can tell has like probably a minor curse. It's not a big deal, but it's like, can they resist
the temptation
of the powerful item? No, probably not. They're PCs.
Yeah.
Or just where their greed gets put to the test because of the fact that like their items are there's a choice between their items and like the life of an NPC or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you don't want to put, because greed is such a powerful motivator for PCs and players, you don't want to put their items at risk very often or almost ever, because they care about that actually more than themselves dying.
Mm-hmm.
So don't expect them to pick your NPC over the items. If they do, expect them to just do it and be mad about it because they felt like the adventure kind of forced them to pick the NPC or be guilted.
Yep.
So
it's pretty unfortunate how common that is.
Yes. And then be like, I can't believe I lost my sword. It's like, well, you chose to save Bob instead of your sword. Yeah, well, I know. Well, it was making me. Something like that. So you have to have the right group.
Yeah.
For anything where you want to use tragedy. And tragedy doesn't necessarily mean permanent loss, but it definitely can be linked with loss. And tragedy and horror can be linked together in the same campaign, but tragedy and comedy can be linked together very powerfully in the same campaign.
Yeah,
too.
when you have it, because these characters in their expression of these flaws can very easily segue over into comedy, can segue over into the unexpected and the shocking and the ridiculous that's funny.
That's right. Or you can start with more of a light-hearted tone, comedy, and success before the reversal, the peripeteia. I looked it up. It was right.
You're right. There you go.
So, essentially, that's how you incorporate the tragic structure into a game session or an ongoing plot for a game. Now, you probably wouldn't be able to use tragedy that easily in an organized play campaign.
Yeah.
Because of the sort of one-off nature of adventures. It doesn't, like, you could write a comedic organized play scenario or a horror organized play scenario, but it's so important for tragedy that you establish a baseline. And show some initial success because of the very strengths of the tragic hero before the reversal, or else it's not a reversal. It's just that everything is bad, gritty, grimdark, which is a genre, and that's a different kind of game that you can run, but that's not a tragedy.
Or it's one of those things where, like, the heroic capacity is sort of an informed ability where you've heard that this person is great, but then when you actually see them on the screen, they're always having that flaw, and then that creates a very distorted sense of that character. I know in organized play, even, like, there can be these certain events that just completely stand out to people and define the character, and then they don't latch on nearly as much to all the other portrayals of that character.
That's true. Like Sheila Hydemark.
Yes, exactly. Sheila Hydemark in Race for the Room-Carved Key, where Sheila was
so villainous, and it scored your tables, and it scored you down for not doing some really shady things. In some cases, shady things that were not a good idea to do compared to the other option.
But
and then like, that really caused people to latch on to the character who was scoring them as being shady. It was actually maybe not meant to do that, but was like brilliantly written to do that because of using multiple different psychological techniques to create that effect.
I mean, that was before my time anyway, but it just it's sort of the arch example in my mind about how when you establish a character in one way in front of the players, it just doesn't really matter what else you say or do. That's going to always be going to be part of how they see that character. So if a lot of other sessions don't have a hope of doing that, then certainly a little bit of information given in the beginning of an adventure in box text doesn't. So there has to be some proper grounding and establishment, and the PCs need to associate this person with sort of their heroic qualities if you want to be able to properly get that across.
And that's why it's so important that it has to be ongoing. You can occasionally have tragic elements in organized play if you have a very long arc with a recurring character. But even then, because of the way that different GMs might portray the character and the out of order way you might play the adventures, can be very hard, and you're likely to wind up with a character that has a very mixed reaction among the community, depending on what order they played, what was their main starting season, and so on.
for sure.
So it's really something best done with consent and with the ability to play an ongoing narrative, especially if you don't want the use of tragedy to be a downer, because then even after the reversal, you want to show that the recognition of their flaw allows them to rise up and become stronger than they were before.
Yeah, and I really, I know I've talked about World of Darkness systems in these fair amount, but I think that they handle that really well in terms of having a what did your character learn as a part of every segment of the story, and that sort of reflection I think helps a lot to think about how your character is learning and growing and how they're realizing like, oh no, that was totally a personality flaw that was causing these huge problems. Now I'm gonna try to do things in a different way.
Yeah, there's a fair number of systems out there that have a little more narrative bent to the XP, where the XP is tied to lessons learned, and it's pretty cool and is a very good way to promote character growth because greed. Everyone wants the XP, right?
Yeah. But I mean, even if your system doesn't necessarily have that, that is something that you can include as a part of the sort of, hey, is a part of the wrap down to a session or the wrap into a next session.
I mean,
so
you
what
could
happened
even
last
do
time,
it in Pathfinder Second Edition as accomplishment XP.
Yeah, you could totally.
Because its accomplishment is supposed to be for something you did that may be a personal or party goal. And if you as the GM say, you know what, learning and growing as a character is an accomplishment that I want to promote, so each session, I'm going to ask everybody, like, what you learned that's going to make a change. I'm going to give accomplishment XP. And just assuming that you guys are going to make the changes that you said and have the PCs learn. And we'll revisit this accomplishment XP and potentially, like, reduce it or something if people are not actually learning or changing from it and just saying that they are. But in general, I think people usually do if given that prompt and the incentive to do so.
And I think that with characters as with real people, it's important to remember that even if there is a change, that it's not going to be like, I have realized this, and I was doing A 100% of the time, and now I'm going to do not A 100% of the time, and I'm never going to do anything that's A. Like,
also,
that doesn't happen.
It's natural for people to change their mind and even change back in certain situations. It's just not natural for someone to say that they learned something. It's not natural to be like episodic TV shows where people appear to maybe have learned a lesson, but if you watch the next episode, they go back to their original characterization from the beginning of the episode because nothing changes or grows.
Yeah.
Like a lot of sitcoms, but especially back in the day, when you just would have to watch it on cable, and who knows what episode you would see.
Exactly, yeah.
All right. Bye, YouTube.
Bye!